June 8th, 793, the North Sea coast of Northumbria. Morning fog clung to the cold waters surrounding a small tidal island, where monks had prayed in peace for over a century and a half. Brother Cuthwin, tending the monastery gardens, looked up from his work as an unfamiliar sound carried across the water, the rhythmic splash of many oars moving in perfect unison. Through the mist, shapes began to emerge. Long, sleek vessels with high, curved prows carved into serpents and dragons. Shields lined the gunwales in alternating colours of red and black. At least 3 ships, perhaps 100 warriors total, their polished weapons catching the pale morning light. The monk dropped his hoe and ran toward the church, shouting a warning that would echo through history. The raiders had come to Lindisfarne. What happened next would send shockwaves through Christian Europe and mark the beginning of an age that would reshape the entire continent. Within hours, the blood of priests would stain the altar stones, treasures accumulated over generations would vanish into the holds of dragon ships, and the name Viking would become synonymous with terror from England to Constantinople. The attack on Lindisfarne wasn't just another raid. It was the moment when Scandinavia announced its arrival on the European stage, when the maritime capabilities of Norse shipbuilders combined with the martial prowess of northern warriors to create a force that would dominate European affairs for the next 3 centuries. This is the story of how a single morning of violence on a remote island monastery changed everything. How technological innovation in shipbuilding gave birth to a new form of warfare. How a culture of honour and glory-seeking transformed peaceful Scandinavian farmers into the most feared raiders in medieval history. And how the Christian world, comfortable in its assumption of cultural superiority, discovered that the heathens from the north had ships that could strike anywhere, warriors who fought with terrifying ferocity and absolutely no respect for the sanctity of churches. The monastery at Lindisfarne had been founded in 635 by St Aidan, an Irish monk summoned by King Oswald of Northumbria to spread Christianity throughout the region. For 158 years, it had grown in wealth and prestige, becoming one of the preeminent centres of Christian learning in Britain. The island itself was a masterpiece of strategic positioning for spiritual isolation, connected to the mainland by a causeway that disappeared beneath the tides twice daily. Lindisfarne offered the perfect combination of accessibility and remoteness. Pilgrims could reach it during low tide, but the twice-daily flooding created natural barriers that enhanced the sense of separation from worldly concerns. By 793, the monastery housed dozens of monks, possessed a renowned scriptorium that had produced the magnificent Lindisfarne Gospels, and served as a major pilgrimage site due to its connection with Saint Cuthbert, whose body had been venerated there until his shrine was moved to Durham. The wealth accumulated over a century and a half was staggering. Gold and silver reliquaries encrusted with precious stones, illuminated manuscripts bound in jewelled covers, chalices and patens of precious metals, silk vestments embroidered with gold thread, all the portable wealth that centuries of pious donations had concentrated in one undefended location, and therein lay the fatal vulnerability. Monasteries in 8th century Britain were places of peace, not fortresses. They had no walls, no garrison, no weapons beyond perhaps a few hunting implements. The monks were men of God, not warriors. Their protection came from the sanctity of their calling, from the assumption that no Christian would dare violate holy ground. It was this assumption that the raiders from the north were about to shatter. The men rowing toward Lindisfarne that June morning represented the culmination of centuries of Scandinavian maritime development. The ships that carried them were technological marvels that gave Vikings capabilities no other European power possessed. The Norse longship wasn't invented overnight. Its design evolved over hundreds of years, building on earlier Scandinavian boat-building traditions that stretched back to the Stone Age. But by the late 8th century, Scandinavian shipwrights had perfected a design that would change naval warfare forever. The vessels approaching Lindisfarne were likely carvy, medium-sized longships between 55 and 75 feet in length, with 6 to 16 pairs of oars. These ships embodied revolutionary design principles that made them uniquely suited for raiding. The construction method was called clinker building, overlapping planks of oak, each strake riveted to the one below it with iron nails, creating a hull that was both strong and flexible. The planks were sealed with wool, animal hair or moss mixed with tar to make them watertight. This overlapping construction gave the hull a flexibility that allowed it to ride over waves rather than pounding through them. The keel, an innovation that had emerged by the 8th century, provided stability and allowed the ships to maintain course in open water, but it was shallow enough that these vessels could operate in as little as 3 feet of water. The combination was devastating. Longships could cross the open ocean, then navigate up rivers and land on beaches, allowing raiders to strike deep inland and escape before any organised response could materialise. The ships were symmetrical, with identical bow and stern. This meant they could reverse direction without turning around, crucial for rapid escapes. They were propelled primarily by oars, typically 24 to 32 rowers depending on the ship's size, but a single square sail made of wool or linen allowed them to harness wind power for longer voyages. The shallow draft was perhaps the most important feature for raiding. While other ships needed harbours, longships could beach anywhere. Sand, gravel, mud, it didn't matter. The Vikings could pull their ships onto shore, conduct their raid, and be gone before defenders arrived. The psychological impact of these ships cannot be overstated. The high curved prows, often carved into dragon heads or serpents, created a silhouette that became synonymous with death. Coastal communities learned to fear that distinctive outline on the horizon. The sound of many oars striking water in unison became the herald of disaster. By 793, Scandinavian shipbuilding had reached a level of sophistication that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. The longship gave Vikings mobility that no one else possessed, allowing them to strike where they wanted when they wanted, and vanish before retribution could be organised. The men aboard those ships were products of a warrior culture that valued martial prowess above almost everything else. In 8th century Scandinavia, a man's worth was measured by his courage in battle, his skill with weapons, and his willingness to seek glory even at the cost of his life. Most weren't professional soldiers, they were farmers who took up arms when opportunity presented itself. During planting and harvest seasons, they worked their land. But in the summer months, when crops required less attention, groups of men would gather under a leader and seek wealth through trade or increasingly through raiding. The weapons they carried reflected both the limitations of Scandinavian iron production and the ingenuity of Norse craftsmen. Every warrior would have carried an axe, not surprising in a culture where every farmer owned axes for clearing land and chopping wood. Battle axes evolved from these utilitarian tools, with broader blades and extended cutting edges designed specifically for combat. Axes were democratic weapons. They required less iron than swords and could be manufactured by any competent blacksmith. A poor man could own an axe. The techniques for using one in battle were straightforward enough that farmers could become reasonably effective fighters with relatively little training. Spears were equally common. A wooden shaft, usually ash for its flexibility and strength, tipped with an iron spearhead that varied from 8 to 24 inches in length. Some spears were designed for throwing, with lighter heads and shorter shafts. Others were meant for thrusting in close combat, with heavier blades and longer reach. Swords were the prestige weapons. Double-edged blades about 36 inches long, weighing between 2.5 and 5.5 pounds. Only wealthy warriors could afford swords, which might be passed down through generations as prized family heirlooms. Many of the best swords were imported from the Frankish Empire, where superior steel production techniques created blades of exceptional quality. The famous Ulfbert swords, with their distinctive inscriptions, were Frankish imports that Vikings prized above locally made weapons. Some Norse swords featured pattern welding, a complex technique that created distinctive rippling patterns on the blade, while producing a weapon that combined the flexibility of iron with the hardness of steel. For protection, most warriors carried round wooden shields, typically about 3 feet in diameter. Made from wooden planks held together with iron or leather, with an iron boss in the centre protecting the hand grip. These shields were as much offensive weapons as defensive ones. Helmets and mail armour were extremely rare. Despite popular images, most Vikings wore no armour at all beyond leather jerkins. A few wealthy warriors might own a mail shirt, but producing one required thousands of individual iron rings, each forged, shaped and riveted by hand. The cost was astronomical. Perhaps one warrior in 50 had mail armour. As for helmets, archaeological evidence suggests they were even rarer than mail shirts. The iconic horned helmet of popular imagination never existed. Real Viking helmets were simple, conical designs of leather or iron, and most warriors wore none at all. The lack of heavy armour wasn't entirely a disadvantage. It made Viking warriors incredibly mobile, able to run, climb and manoeuvre in ways that heavily armoured opponents couldn't match. Combined with their ship's ability to land anywhere, this mobility became a devastating tactical advantage. But beyond weapons and ships, what really made Vikings terrifying was their mentality. This was a culture that celebrated death in battle as the highest honour. Warriors who died with weapons in hand were believed to be chosen by Odin for his hall in Valhalla, where they would feast and fight until Ragnarok. This wasn't abstract theology. Vikings genuinely believed that dying gloriously in combat secured eternal paradise. The effect on their fighting behaviour was profound. They could commit to attacks with a ferocity that shocked opponents who valued survival. The famous berserkers, warriors who worked themselves into battle frenzy, represented the extreme end of this mindset. Whether their rage was drug-induced, psychological or spiritual remains debated. What's certain is that the sight of screaming warriors attacking with apparently no concern for their own survival had a devastating psychological effect on enemies. As the longships ground onto the beach at Lindisfarne, the monks had no frame of reference for what was about to happen. No British monastery had faced this kind of assault. These weren't bandits or thieves. These were organised military formations equipped with the best ships in the world, arriving by surprise with overwhelming force. The raiders moved with practised efficiency. Some secured the ships, others spread out to prevent anyone from escaping the island to raise the alarm on the mainland. The main force headed directly for the monastery buildings. They knew exactly what they were after: gold, silver, anything portable and valuable, plus human captives who could be sold as slaves in Scandinavian markets or ransomed back to their communities. The monks' response was helpless horror. Some fled, others hid. A few older brothers stood their ground, perhaps attempting to reason with the attackers or appealing to divine mercy. The Vikings weren't interested in debate. This was a business transaction to them. The monastery contained wealth. They had the capability to take it, therefore they would take it. The fact that their victims were holy men meant nothing. The raiders' pagan worldview had no concept of Christian sanctity. Churches were just buildings that happened to contain valuable objects. Priests were potential slaves or obstacles to be removed. The efficiency of the slaughter suggests this wasn't the first raid these particular Vikings had conducted. They knew how to organise an attack, how to move through buildings systematically, how to identify valuable items and ignore worthless ones. Some monks were killed immediately, probably those who resisted or tried to protect the treasures. Others were rounded up as captives. Contemporary accounts mention monks being driven out naked after being stripped of their robes, some driven into the sea to drown, others taken as slaves. The violence wasn't random savagery, it was calculated terror designed to prevent resistance and ensure compliance. Dead monks couldn't interfere with the looting, and the sight of their respected religious leaders being killed or humiliated paralysed any thoughts of resistance from survivors. The raiders worked fast. They knew the tide schedule. Once it turned, the causeway to the mainland would emerge from the water, allowing reinforcements to reach the island. The window for raiding was limited by natural forces as much as by potential military response. They smashed open reliquaries, tore jewelled covers from manuscripts, seized silver chalices and gold religious vessels, silk vestments, altar cloths, anything that could be sold or melted down for precious metal content. Some items had religious significance to the raiders too. High-status Vikings sometimes wore crosses taken from Christian churches as decorative jewellery, symbols of their travels and successful raids rather than religious statements. Within a few hours the work was complete. The treasures were loaded into the ships. Captive monks were shackled in the holds. The dragon ships pushed off the beach and disappeared into the sea from which they had emerged. They left behind a scene of devastation. Bodies of murdered monks lay scattered in the church and surrounding buildings. Blood stained the altar where Mass had been celebrated that morning. Manuscripts lay trampled in the dirt, their jewelled covers torn away. The survivors, traumatized and helpless, watched the ships vanish toward the north. The physical damage could eventually be repaired. Buildings could be rebuilt. New brothers could join the community. Replacement liturgical items could be commissioned. But something fundamental had changed. The assumption of safety, the belief that monasteries were protected by divine sanction, and cultural taboo had been shattered. Nowhere was safe. If the Vikings could strike Lindisfarne, one of the most important religious sites in Britain, they could strike anywhere. Word of the disaster spread with remarkable speed. Within weeks, news had reached the court of Charlemagne in Francia, where an English scholar named Alcuin heard about the attack on his homeland. Alcuin of York was one of the most prominent intellectuals in Europe, serving as Charlemagne's chief educational advisor and head of the palace school at Aachen. Born and educated in Northumbria, he maintained close connections with the church there and corresponded regularly with religious leaders in England. When he learned that Lindisfarne had been attacked, Alcuin was horrified. He immediately wrote letters to King Ethelred of Northumbria, to Archbishop Ethelhard, and to Higbald, Bishop of Lindisfarne, expressing his shock and attempting to understand how such a catastrophe could have occurred. His letter to Bishop Higbald, written in 793, has survived and provides the most detailed contemporary reaction to the raid. Alcuin wrote, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. It was not thought possible that such an inroad from the sea could be made. Behold, the church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments. A place more venerable than all in Britain has fallen prey to pagans." The language is apocalyptic. Alcuin describes the attack not just as theft or murder, but as desecration, violation, sacrilege. The monks are called saints. Their blood has defiled holy ground. The pagans are described as having trampled the bodies of saints like dung in the street. For Alcuin and his Christian contemporaries, this wasn't just a crime, it was a cosmic violation, an attack on God himself through his servants. The shock resonated throughout Christian Europe because Lindisfarne represented something beyond its material wealth. It was a symbol of Christianity's triumph in Britain, a living connection to the heroic age of missionary work when Irish and Roman monks had converted the pagan Anglo-Saxons. To see such a place violated by pagans from the north suggested that civilization itself was under assault. Alcuin's response reveals how unprepared the Christian world was for this new threat. His first instinct was to seek theological explanations. Why had God allowed this to happen? What sins had the people of Northumbria committed that brought divine punishment upon them? In his letter to King Ethelred, Alcuin suggested that moral corruption among the Northumbrians might have provoked God's wrath. He criticised them for adopting pagan fashions, for drunkenness, for luxury and moral laxity. He referenced the recent murder of King Elfwald by the nobleman, Sicca, who then committed suicide. Perhaps, Alcuin suggested, these sins had removed divine protection from Northumbria, allowing the pagans to strike with impunity. This theological interpretation would persist throughout the Viking Age. Christian writers consistently portrayed Viking raids as divine punishment for Christian sins rather than as military operations with strategic and economic motivations. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled in the late 9th century but incorporating earlier material, recorded that 793 saw terrifying portents before the Lindisfarne raid. Immense sheets of light rushing through the air, and whirlwinds and fiery dragons flying across the firmament. Whether these phenomena actually occurred or were added retrospectively as apocalyptic window dressing, they reflected the Christian interpretation of Viking raids as supernatural events rather than human military actions. This theological framework prevented Christian leaders from understanding their real situation. They interpreted Viking attacks as moral crises requiring spiritual reform rather than as strategic threats requiring military response. Decades would pass before Anglo-Saxon kingdoms developed effective counter-strategies against Viking raids, but hidden in Alcuin's horrified letters was an accurate prediction. He warned that the Lindisfarne attack might be the beginning of greater tribulation. On this point, he was absolutely correct. The success of the Lindisfarne raid demonstrated that British monasteries were vulnerable, wealthy, and undefended. Other Vikings, hearing about the easy plunder to be had, began planning their own expeditions. In 794, raiders struck the monastery at Jarrow, where the Venerable Bede had written his ecclesiastical history. In 795, they hit the monastery on the island of Iona in Scotland. In 798, they raided St. Patrick's Island off Ireland. The pattern was clear. Viking raiders had identified a new source of wealth and were systematically exploiting it. Monasteries continued to be primary targets throughout the late 8th and early 9th centuries because they combined maximum wealth with minimum defence. The raids followed a predictable pattern: appear suddenly from the sea, strike fast with overwhelming force, take everything portable of value, capture anyone who could be enslaved or ransomed, disappear before defenders could organize. The longship made this strategy possible. No other vessel could cross open ocean, navigate coastal waters in all weather, land on any beach, penetrate rivers deep inland, and escape before retribution arrived. The Vikings had achieved mobility that made them nearly impossible to counter with conventional military forces. European armies were organized around land warfare. Troops moved on foot or horseback. Response times were measured in days. By the time a king could mobilize his forces and march to a raided location, the Vikings were hundreds of miles away. The sea was their highway, giving them interior lines of communication that landbound defenders couldn't match. Naval pursuit was impossible. Other European cultures had ships, but nothing remotely comparable to longships. Byzantine dromons were powerful warships, but they needed deep-water harbours. Frankish and Anglo-Saxon vessels were primarily cargo ships, too slow and unwieldy to catch the swift Viking craft. For several decades, Vikings raided with near impunity. The wealth flowing back to Scandinavia from these raids had profound effects on Viking society. Successful raiders gained prestige, attracted followers, and used their new wealth to commission better ships and equipment for future expeditions. Success bred more raids. Young men who might have remained farmers saw opportunities for wealth and glory. Jarls, the Norse equivalent of lords, organised larger and more ambitious expeditions. The raids created a feedback loop. Success generated resources for more raids, which generated more success, which attracted more participants. What started as opportunistic attacks by small groups escalated into a sustained campaign of raiding that would continue for generations. But the Viking expansion wasn't purely military. Trade was equally important. Many of the same ships and men involved in raiding also engaged in legitimate commerce. Vikings established trading posts throughout northern Europe and Russia, connecting Scandinavian goods with markets from Ireland to Constantinople. The dichotomy of Vikings as both traders and raiders reflected their pragmatic worldview. If you could trade profitably, you traded. If raiding was more lucrative, you raided. Often the same group would do both on a single voyage, trading in well-defended ports and raiding vulnerable targets along the way. This combination of commerce and violence, enabled by superior maritime technology, allowed Vikings to insert themselves into European affairs in ways that traditional military conquest couldn't achieve. They didn't need to conquer kingdoms. They could simply arrive, take what they wanted, and leave. The threat of future raids gave them negotiating leverage with rulers desperate to protect their subjects. By the mid-9th century, Frankish and Anglo-Saxon kings were paying Danegeld, protection money to prevent Viking attacks. This wasn't extortion in the criminal sense, it was a rational economic transaction. The king calculated that paying tribute was cheaper than the damage a raid would inflict. For Vikings, Danegeld was often more profitable than raiding since it provided guaranteed income without the risks of combat. The Lindisfarne raid began this entire process. It was the proof of concept that demonstrated the viability of seaborne raiding against European targets. Everything that followed, the centuries of Viking expansion, the establishment of Norse kingdoms in Britain and Ireland, the Norman conquest, the founding of Russia, the discovery of Iceland, Greenland, and North America, all of it, became possible because warriors in dragon ships discovered that wealthy monasteries on remote islands would surrender their treasures without meaningful resistance. The legacy of June 8, 793 wasn't just the treasure taken, or the monks killed. It was the demonstration that longships gave Vikings capabilities that would reshape medieval Europe. The shield wall hadn't literally crashed into Europe at Lindisfarne. Most of the actual fighting probably consisted of Vikings killing unresisting monks. But metaphorically, the raid represented the arrival of Scandinavian martial culture onto the European stage. For the next 3 centuries, the distinctive silhouette of dragon ships would herald the arrival of warriors who fought with ferocity the Christian kingdoms couldn't match, who possessed maritime technology that wouldn't be equaled for generations, and who would fundamentally alter the political, cultural, and demographic landscape of medieval Europe. The monastery at Lindisfarne survived. A Christian community persisted on the island, though the monks eventually fled with St. Cuthbert's relics when raids continued. A new priory was established after the Norman conquest. The island remains a place of pilgrimage to this day. But the world those monks inhabited on June 7th, 793, disappeared forever when the dragon ships appeared through the morning fog. The age of Christian Britain's isolation from European military conflicts ended. The Viking Age had begun. The thunder of northern oars would echo through Europe for 300 years, and it all started with a single morning of violence on a remote island monastery where unarmed monks prayed and wealthy treasures lay undefended. History would remember June 8th, 793, not for how much treasure was taken or how many monks died, but as the moment when Europe discovered that the pagans from the north had ships that could go anywhere, warriors who feared nothing and absolutely no respect for the sanctity of Christian holy places. Alcuin's prediction proved prophetic. It was indeed the beginning of greater tribulation. The dragon ships would return again and again until the kingdoms of Europe learned to defend themselves or negotiated accommodation with the northern raiders. Some kingdoms fell entirely, others adapted and survived, but none could ignore the threat that arrived at Lindisfarne on that June morning in 793. The shield wall had crashed into Europe, and nothing would be the same. The transformation of Viking raiding from opportunistic attacks into a systematic campaign of conquest began within a generation of Lindisfarne. The early raids had been hit and run affairs, small groups seeking portable wealth. By the 830s, the scale and ambition had expanded dramatically. Instead of dozen ship raids targeting monasteries, fleets of hundreds of vessels began appearing, carrying armies rather than raiding parties. The shift reflected changes within Scandinavia itself. Population pressure, political consolidation, and climate factors were pushing more people to seek opportunities abroad. Younger sons who wouldn't inherit land needed to establish themselves somehow. Warriors displaced by emerging royal power in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden looked for new territories where they could carve out domains of their own. The great heathen army that invaded England in 865 represented this new phase. This wasn't a raiding party. It was a coalition of warriors from across Scandinavia, thousands strong, intent on conquest rather than plunder. Led by the legendary sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Uber, they landed in East Anglia and proceeded to systematically conquer Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Within 5 years they had destroyed the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Only Wessex under Alfred the Great survived, and even then barely. The speed of Viking conquest shocked contemporaries. Ancient kingdoms that had existed for centuries fell in seasons. The military advantages that Vikings possessed, mobility, ferocity, superior tactical flexibility, proved decisive against the larger but less nimble Anglo-Saxon armies. The success in England inspired similar campaigns elsewhere. In Francia, Vikings sailed up the Seine and besieged Paris in 845, extracting huge tribute payments. They established permanent bases along rivers, transforming seasonal raids into year-round occupation. The monastery of St. Denis was sacked. Rouen was captured and held. Frankish kings found themselves negotiating with Viking chieftains who controlled major waterways. Ireland suffered perhaps most extensively. The island's political fragmentation, dozens of small kingdoms constantly warring among themselves, made it almost impossible to mount coordinated resistance. Vikings established fortified settlements at Dublin, Waterford, Wexford, Cork, and Limerick, transforming from raiders into rulers. These Norse-Irish kingdoms would persist for centuries, creating a hybrid culture that blended Scandinavian and Celtic elements. But Vikings weren't just warriors. The settlements they established became commercial hubs. Dublin grew into one of the most important trading cities in the North Atlantic. Viking merchants connected markets from Byzantium to Baghdad, from Greenland to the Mediterranean. The same maritime capabilities that made them terrifying raiders made them excellent traders. The Varangian Vikings, mostly Swedes, pushed east into Russia, establishing the Rus state that would eventually become the foundation of modern Russia and Ukraine. They controlled trade routes connecting Scandinavia with Constantinople and the Islamic caliphates, growing wealthy on commerce in furs, slaves, amber, and eastern luxury goods. In the western Mediterranean, Vikings raided along the coasts of Spain and Morocco, sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, and attacked targets in Italy. In 859, a fleet under the legendary Björn Ironside and Hastein sailed all the way to the Mediterranean, spending 2 years raiding along the coasts before returning to Scandinavia loaded with plunder. The geographical scope of Viking expansion during the 9th and 10th centuries was staggering. From Baghdad, where Scandinavian merchants traded in the Abbasid Caliphate's markets, to Newfoundland, where Norse settlers established temporary colonies around the year 1000, Vikings ranged across an area spanning thousands of miles. No other medieval European culture achieved comparable geographical reach. This expansion was made possible by continued innovations in ship design. The longship evolved throughout the Viking Age, with vessels growing larger and more specialised. Nars, cargo ships with deeper drafts and higher sides, carried settlers and trade goods. Drekar, dragon ships, the largest warships, could carry crews of 60 to 80 warriors. The Skuldelev ships, preserved in Denmark, show the diversity of Viking vessels, from small fishing boats to ocean-going cargo carriers to sleek warships. The navigational skills required to accomplish these voyages were extraordinary. Vikings sailed across open ocean without compasses, sextants, or detailed charts. They used sophisticated dead reckoning, following coastlines when possible, but also making direct ocean crossings when necessary. They observed the sun's position to maintain latitude. They noted the behaviour of seabirds, which indicated proximity to land. They studied wave patterns and cloud formations. They used lodestone, naturally magnetic rock, to determine rough directions. The famous sunstone, possibly Iceland's spar crystal that could locate the sun's position even through clouds, may have been a navigational tool. The discovery and settlement of Iceland demonstrated Viking navigational capabilities. Around 870, Norwegian chieftain Ingolfur Arnason established the first permanent settlement at Reykjavik. Within decades, Iceland's inhabitable regions were fully settled by Norse colonists, creating a new Scandinavian society in the North Atlantic. The Icelandic sagas, written down in the 13th century but preserving oral traditions from the settlement period, provide detailed accounts of these voyages and the establishment of Viking society in a previously uninhabited land. From Iceland, Vikings pushed further west. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for murder around 982, explored and settled Greenland, establishing colonies on the southwestern coast that would persist for centuries. His son, Leif Erikson, sailed west from Greenland around the year 1000 and reached North America, establishing a temporary settlement at Lonso Meadows in Newfoundland. This Norse discovery of America, 5 centuries before Columbus, demonstrated the extreme range of Viking seafaring. The journey from Greenland to North America required crossing hundreds of miles of open North Atlantic waters in wooden ships without modern navigation equipment. That Vikings accomplished this, routinely enough to establish settlements, even temporary ones, shows maritime capabilities that wouldn't be matched until the age of European exploration in the 15th century. Back in Europe, the Viking presence was forcing fundamental changes in how kingdoms organised themselves. The traditional Anglo-Saxon military system, where farmers were called up for seasonal service, proved inadequate against enemies who could strike anywhere, any time, and disappear before conventional forces could respond. Alfred the Great of Wessex pioneered new defensive strategies. He established a network of fortified towns called burhs, positioned so that no one was more than 20 miles from a defended position. He reorganised the fyrd, the Anglo-Saxon militia, so that half were always available for military service while the other half worked their farms. He built a fleet specifically designed to counter Viking longships. Alfred's reforms worked. Wessex survived when other kingdoms fell. His successors would eventually reconquer the Danelaw, the regions of England under Viking control, and create a unified English kingdom. But this took generations, and even after reconquest, the Viking influence persisted in language, law, and culture throughout northern and eastern England. In Francia, Charles the Bald tried paying Danegeld to buy peace. When that failed, his successor Charles the Simple took a different approach. In 911, he granted the Viking chieftain Rollo territory in northern Francia in exchange for defending it against other Vikings. This grant became the Duchy of Normandy, Northmen's land. Within a few generations, the Norse settlers had adopted French language and Christian religion while retaining their martial traditions. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy, descendant of Viking raiders, would conquer England, bringing Viking military techniques full circle. The Viking conversion to Christianity represented a major turning point. The process was gradual and complex, often driven by political calculation as much as spiritual conviction. Chieftains who controlled territory in Christian lands found that converting opened diplomatic and commercial opportunities. Christian merchants were more willing to trade with Christian Vikings. Christian kings were more willing to negotiate with Christian Vikings. The symbolic significance was enormous. Vikings had burst onto the European stage as terrifying pagans who showed no respect for Christian sanctity. Their conversion and absorption into Christian European civilization represented, from the Church's perspective, the triumph of Christianity over paganism. Churches that Vikings had once burned were rebuilt with Viking money. Monasteries that had been raided became homes to Viking monks. Denmark's conversion in the mid-10th century under Harald Bluetooth marked the beginning of the end of the Viking Age as originally conceived. Norway followed under Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, though the process was violent and contested. Sweden was the last to convert, with paganism persisting in some regions into the 12th century. As Scandinavian kingdoms converted to Christianity and developed more centralized royal authority, the conditions that had created the Viking phenomenon changed. Young men seeking glory and wealth could no longer simply gather followers and go raiding. Kings claimed monopolies on violence. Churches condemned piracy and raiding. The gradual integration of Scandinavia into medieval Christian Europe transformed Vikings from terrifying outsiders into just another set of European kingdoms. But the legacy of the Viking Age persisted long after the raids ended. The Scandinavian settlements fundamentally altered the demographic and cultural landscape of Northern Europe. The Danelaw in England, the Norse kingdoms in Ireland, the Duchy of Normandy, the Rus state in Eastern Europe, all represented permanent Viking presence in regions where they had originally arrived as raiders. The genetic legacy is still visible today. Modern genetic studies show significant Scandinavian ancestry in populations throughout areas of Viking settlement. Place names across northern England, Ireland, Scotland and Normandy preserve Old Norse words. English borrowed hundreds of words from Old Norse, including fundamental terms like sky, window, husband and they. Legal concepts from Viking law influenced the development of English common law. The maritime technology that enabled Viking expansion diffused throughout Europe. Shipbuilding techniques influenced later medieval ship design. The navigational knowledge accumulated by Viking explorers contributed to the later age of exploration. The commercial networks Vikings established connected disparate regions and facilitated trade on a scale that wouldn't be seen again until much later. The military impact was equally significant. Viking tactics, emphasizing mobility, surprise, and concentration of force, influenced medieval warfare. The shield wall, the basic Viking infantry formation, became standard throughout Northern Europe. The effectiveness of combined naval and ground operations demonstrated by Viking campaigns influenced later amphibious warfare tactics. Perhaps most importantly, the Viking Age forced European kingdoms to develop more effective governmental systems. The need to respond to Viking threats drove innovations in taxation, military organization, fortification, and administration. Kings who successfully resisted Vikings like Alfred the Great did so by fundamentally reorganizing how their kingdoms functioned. These organizational innovations persisted long after the Viking threat ended. The cultural legacy is more ambiguous. Medieval Christian writers portrayed Vikings as barbarous pagans, agents of divine punishment for Christian sins. This negative image persisted for centuries. The 19th century Romantic movement rehabilitated Vikings, transforming them into heroic adventurers and explorers. Modern popular culture continues to romanticize Vikings, often ignoring the reality that much of their interaction with Europe involved theft, slavery, and murder. The truth is more complex than either the medieval vilification or modern romanticization suggests. Vikings were products of their time and culture, acting according to values and motivations that made sense within their worldview. They were extraordinarily skilled seafarers whose maritime technology was centuries ahead of their contemporaries. They were effective warriors whose tactical innovations influenced medieval warfare. They were also raiders and slavers who caused immense suffering throughout regions they attacked. The monk murdered at Lindisfarne on June 8, 793, experienced the terrifying reality of Viking violence. His death, multiplied across thousands of similar victims throughout the Viking Age, represented genuine human tragedy. But that same Viking expansion created the foundations for medieval European commercial networks, contributed to the development of effective governance systems, and spread Scandinavian culture and genetics throughout vast regions. History rarely presents simple moral narratives. The Viking Age was simultaneously a period of creative cultural synthesis and destructive violence, of remarkable exploratory achievement and brutal conquest, of technological innovation and human suffering. The dragon ships that appeared through the fog at Lindisfarne carried both. They brought death to that monastery and transformation to Europe. In attacking Lindisfarne, those raiders began a process that would reshape the medieval world, creating new kingdoms, new cultures, and new historical trajectories that continue to influence us today. The shield wall had crashed into Europe, and when it finally withdrew, nothing remained unchanged. The archaeological evidence for Viking presence across Europe tells stories that written sources often miss. While medieval chroniclers focused on raids and battles, the material remains reveal a more complex picture of how Vikings actually lived, traded, and integrated with local populations. Excavations at Jorvik, the Viking name for York, have uncovered an entire Norse city beneath modern streets. The remains show workshops where craftsmen produced leather goods, metalwork, jewellery, and textiles. Chemical analysis of soil samples reveals the smells that would have filled Viking streets, a pungent mixture of human waste, rotting organic matter, and industrial processes. These weren't temporary raiding camps. Vikings built permanent settlements with complex economies and social structures. Dublin's Fishamble Street excavations revealed similar complexity. Viking Dublin was a major manufacturing centre, producing goods for export throughout the North Atlantic trade network. Archaeologists found evidence of ship repair facilities, metal workshops, textile production, and extensive trade connections, reaching from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. Viking merchants in Dublin handled walrus ivory from Greenland, silk from Byzantium, silver from the Islamic world, and local Irish goods. The burial sites provide intimate glimpses into Viking beliefs and social hierarchies. Ship burials, where important individuals were interred in vessels meant to carry them to the afterlife, demonstrate the central importance of ships in Viking culture. The Osberg ship burial in Norway, discovered in 1904, contained not just a magnificently preserved longship, but also 2 female skeletons, elaborate grave goods including a wagon, sledges, textiles, and wooden artefacts that provided unprecedented information about Viking craftsmanship and women's roles. The Gokstad ship burial yielded a seaworthy vessel so well preserved that a replica successfully crossed the Atlantic in 1893, proving that Viking ships could indeed make ocean voyages. The grave goods included weapons, tools, gaming pieces, and even peacock feathers from India, demonstrating the vast geographical range of Viking trade networks. Hordes of buried treasure, scattered across regions Vikings controlled, tell stories of violence and uncertainty. When danger threatened, people buried their valuables hoping to recover them later. That they never returned suggests the danger was fatal. The Cuerdal hoard discovered in Lancashire in 1840 contained over 8,000 silver objects, mostly coins but also ingots and jewellery, weighing over 88 pounds total. This enormous treasure, buried around 905, represents wealth, accumulated through trade, tribute, and raiding across the Viking world. Analysis of the coins in Viking hoards reveals the extent of their trading networks. Arabic dirhams minted in Baghdad appear alongside Anglo-Saxon pennies, Frankish deniers, and Scandinavian hack silver. Vikings operated in a truly international commercial system, accepting currency from any source and evaluating it purely by metal content rather than issuing authority. The practice of hack silver, cutting up jewellery and coins to make exact weight payments, demonstrates Viking pragmatism. Beautiful arm rings and elaborate brooches were chopped into fragments without sentiment, because metal value mattered more than artistic merit. Archaeological finds show cut fragments of Arabic coins, broken Byzantine jewellery, and chopped up Anglo-Saxon silver all mixed together in traders' purses. The slave trade, though morally horrifying, was economically fundamental to Viking expansion. Scandinavian economies needed labour, and raiding provided it. Captives taken in Britain, Ireland and Francia were transported north and sold in Scandinavian markets, or further east to buyers in the Byzantine Empire and Islamic caliphates. The Norse word thrall for slave entered the vocabulary of every language Vikings touched. Dublin became Europe's largest slave market during the 9th and 10th centuries. Irish captives were particularly valuable because Ireland's political fragmentation meant constant warfare produced steady supplies of prisoners. Viking merchants bought captives from Irish kings who had captured them from rival kingdoms, creating a triangular trade in human misery that enriched all participants except the enslaved. The scale was enormous. Estimates suggest tens of thousands of people were enslaved and transported by Vikings during the 9th and 10th centuries alone. The demographic impact on source regions was significant. Some rural areas of Britain and Ireland were depopulated by slave raiding, forcing survivors to abandon exposed settlements for more defensible locations. The sexual violence accompanying Viking raids rarely appears explicitly in medieval sources, but the genetic evidence is unambiguous. Modern DNA studies show significant Scandinavian paternal ancestry, but much less Scandinavian maternal ancestry in Iceland, suggesting male Vikings took local wives or concubines. In Britain and Ireland, the pattern is more balanced, indicating both Viking men and women settled there. The genetic legacy of Viking violence and intermarriage persists in modern populations 1,000 years later. Women's roles in Viking society were more complex than simple victimhood, though. Scandinavian women enjoyed legal rights unusual for medieval Europe. They could own property, initiate divorce, and inherit wealth. Some accompanied raiding expeditions, not necessarily as warriors despite later romantic myths, but as settlers and administrators of conquered territories. Archaeological finds of female graves with weapons are rare but real, suggesting some women did participate in martial activities, though whether as warriors or for ceremonial reasons remains debated. The sagas, written down centuries after the events they describe, preserve oral traditions about remarkable Viking women. Aud the Deep-Minded, a Norwegian princess who became a wealthy landowner in Iceland after her husband and son were killed, represented female agency within Viking culture. Her story shows women could wield considerable power, particularly if they survived male relatives and inherited their wealth. The transformation of Viking religion from paganism to Christianity was neither instant nor complete. For generations, Vikings practiced a pragmatic syncretism, adopting Christian symbols and practices when useful, while maintaining traditional beliefs. Warriors wore both Thor's hammer amulets and Christian crosses, hedging their spiritual bets. Graves from the transition period contain mixtures of pagan and Christian burial practices, suggesting people weren't entirely certain which gods might prove real. The Old Norse gods represented idealized warrior virtues. Odin was the god of wisdom, poetry, and war, but also cunning and sacrifice. Thor was strength and protection, the defender of order against chaos. Freya governed love, fertility, and magic. These weren't distant, judgmental deities but accessible figures who embodied human qualities magnified to divine scale. The Christian gods seemed less immediately relatable to warrior culture. Concepts like turning the other cheek and loving one's enemies contradicted fundamental Viking values about honor and revenge. Yet Christianity offered advantages. It provided literacy through Latin, connecting converts to broader European intellectual traditions. It offered diplomatic legitimacy, making Christian Vikings acceptable negotiating partners for European kingdoms, and it promised eternal salvation rather than the uncertain fate that awaited pagans. The conversion process was often violent. Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, converted during raids in England, returned home determined to Christianize his kingdom by force. He destroyed pagan temples, executed resistors, and used torture to compel conversion. His methods worked in that Norway became officially Christian, but the brutality created lasting resentment. When Olaf died in battle in 1000, many Norwegians briefly reverted to paganism before his successor resumed forced conversion. Iceland's conversion in the year 1000 took a different path. At the Althing, the National Assembly, pagan and Christian factions threatened civil war over religious differences. The law speaker Thorgeir Ljosvetningagodi agreed to decide the matter. After a day and night of meditation under a cloak, he ruled that Iceland would be Christian, but allowed private pagan worship to continue. This pragmatic compromise preserved social peace while accomplishing political conversion. Sweden's conversion was slowest and most contested. The great pagan temple at Uppsala, described by medieval chronicler Adam of Bremen as containing golden statues of Thor, Odin, and Freya, continued functioning into the late 11th century. Swedish kings who converted to Christianity were sometimes expelled by pagan factions. Only gradually, through a combination of missionary work, political pressure, and generational change, did Sweden become predominantly Christian by the 12th century. The end of paganism meant the end of old burial practices. Ship burials ceased. Grave goods disappeared as Christian theology rejected furnishing the dead for an afterlife journey. The elaborate funeral rituals described by Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Rus chieftain's funeral on the Volga in 922, including human sacrifice and ship burning, belonged to a cultural world that conversion was extinguishing. Ibn Fadlan's account, preserved in his travel narrative, provides one of the few detailed descriptions of pagan Viking religious practices by an outside observer. He described 10 days of funeral preparations, the building of a wooden structure around the dead chieftain's ship, the volunteer selection of a slave girl to die with her master, and the elaborate ritual culminating in burning the ship with the bodies inside. His description is both fascinating and horrifying, revealing a culture utterly alien to Islamic and Christian values. The military technology that made Vikings formidable continued evolving throughout the Viking Age. Weapons became more sophisticated, swords grew longer and acquired more complex hilts. Axes developed specialized combat designs with thinner, sharper blades optimized for cutting through mail. Spears featured broader blades with wings to prevent overpenetration. Chainmail became more common among wealthy warriors by the late Viking Age. Manufacturing techniques improved, allowing production of lighter, more flexible armour. A mail shirt still required months of labour, linking thousands of individual rings. But workshops specialising in armour could produce them more efficiently than individual smiths working alone. Helmet design also evolved. The Gjermundbu helmet, the only complete Viking Age helmet ever found, discovered in Norway in 1943, shows sophisticated construction with iron bowl, nose guard, and eye protection. Far from crude, it represents excellent protective design that balanced coverage with visibility and comfort. That only one has survived archaeologically suggests helmets were valuable enough to be recycled rather than buried with owners. The weapons themselves were works of art. Pattern-welded swords featured intricate designs created by twisting and forge-welding different types of steel. The resulting blades combined the flexibility of low-carbon iron with the hardness of high-carbon steel, creating superior weapons that were also beautiful. The rippling patterns visible on polished blades were prized as much for aesthetics as functionality. Weapon decorations carried symbolic meaning. Inlaid silver and copper wire formed geometric patterns, animal motifs, and runic inscriptions. Some inscriptions were maker's marks, others owners' names, still others magical formulas intended to empower the weapon. The famous Ulfbert swords bear the inscription Ulfbert in iron wire inlaid into the blade, marking them as premium imports with reliable quality. The tactical evolution of Viking warfare reflected their increasing integration into European military systems. Early Viking tactics emphasized surprise, mobility, and overwhelming local superiority. Later Vikings fought pitched battles against organized armies, requiring different approaches. The shield wall, the basic infantry formation, consisted of warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, with overlapping shields creating a defensive barrier. From behind this wall, warriors thrust spears or swung axes while protected by their shields and their neighbours' shields. Breaking an enemy shield wall required discipline and courage. Vikings used wedge formations called Svinfylking or Boar's Head to concentrate force at a single point. Warriors in the front ranks pushed forward while those behind added weight, attempting to penetrate the enemy line through sheer momentum. Once a gap opened, warriors poured through to attack from flanks and rear where shields provided less protection. Berserkers, the legendary warriors who fought in uncontrollable frenzy, supposedly led these wedge attacks. Whether berserkers were real warriors who achieved altered mental states through ritual or psychological preparation, or whether they were literary inventions reflecting idealized warrior fury, remains debated. Contemporary sources mention them, suggesting some reality behind the legend, but descriptions are so exaggerated that separating fact from myth is impossible. The great battles of the late Viking Age demonstrated how fully Vikings had integrated into European military systems. The Battle of Malden in 991, immortalised in an Old English poem, saw Viking raiders fight a formal pitched battle against Essex militia under Ealdorman Byrhtnoth. Both sides deployed in shield walls and exchanged challenges and taunts before fighting. The Vikings won, but the battle's formality showed they were no longer purely raiders, but also conventional warriors who understood European military customs. The Battle of Clontarf in 1014 saw High King Brian Boru of Ireland defeat a coalition of Dublin Vikings and rebellious Irish kings. The battle involved thousands of warriors on each side fighting a conventional engagement that lasted all day. Though Brian was killed in his moment of victory, the Irish victory marked the beginning of Norse Dublin's decline as an independent power. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 marked the end of the Viking Age in dramatic fashion. King Harold Godwinson of England defeated an invasion force led by Harald Hardrada of Norway, killing Hardrada and destroying the Norwegian army. The battle demonstrated that by the mid-11th century, Anglo-Saxon military organisation had evolved to effectively counter Viking invasions. Ironically, 3 weeks later, Harold was defeated and killed at Hastings by William of Normandy, whose ancestors were Vikings, but who commanded an army organised along continental feudal lines. The Norman conquest represented Viking legacy in transformed form. The Normans who conquered England were descendants of Vikings who had settled in Francia barely 150 years earlier. They had adopted French language, Christian religion, and continental military techniques, particularly heavy cavalry. Yet their success owed something to the aggressive expansionism and military effectiveness of their Viking ancestors. The Bayeux Tapestry, embroidered within decades of the conquest, depicts the invasion in remarkable detail. The ships used by William's army to cross the Channel look remarkably similar to Viking longships, showing continuity in naval technology. But the heavily armoured Norman knights charging at Hastings represented a military evolution beyond Viking infantry tactics. Norman expansion didn't stop at England. Norman adventurers conquered southern Italy and Sicily from Byzantines and Arabs. They established kingdoms that blended Viking military traditions, French feudalism, Byzantine administration, and Islamic cultural elements. The Kingdom of Sicily under Roger the Q became one of the most sophisticated states in medieval Europe, a cosmopolitan realm where Latin, Greek, and Arabic were all official languages. The Varangian Guard in Constantinople represented another form of Viking transformation. Scandinavian warriors, particularly from Sweden and later from England after the Norman conquest, served Byzantine emperors as elite bodyguards. These Vikings, far from their homeland, protected Greek emperors against Greek rivals, while accumulating wealth that would have seemed impossible to their raiding ancestors. The Varangian Guard persisted into the 14th century, long after the Viking Age proper had ended. The economic integration of Scandinavia into medieval Europe gradually eliminated the conditions that had created the Viking phenomenon. As kingdoms centralised power, kings monopolised violence and suppressed independent raiding. As Christianity spread, the Church condemned piracy and violence against fellow Christians. As trade became more regularised, merchants found peaceful commerce more profitable than risky raids. The climate itself may have contributed. The medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250, created favourable conditions for Norse expansion into marginal regions like Iceland and Greenland. As temperatures declined in the late medieval period, Norse colonies in Greenland became increasingly difficult to sustain. The western settlement was abandoned around 1350, the eastern settlement sometime in the 15th century. Changing climate made the North Atlantic less hospitable, reducing the viability of long-distance Norse voyaging. Population pressure eased as opportunities for internal expansion within Scandinavia increased. Land clearance created new farms, improved agricultural techniques increased productivity. The pressure that had driven younger sons to seek fortunes abroad declined as opportunities at home expanded. By the 12th century, Scandinavian kingdoms had more in common with other European states than with their Viking Age predecessors. The Christianization of Scandinavia brought literacy, written laws, and bureaucratic administration. Royal power strengthened as kings adopted European models of governance. The independent jarls and chieftains who had led independent raiding expeditions were absorbed into royal administration or suppressed. The anarchic freedom that had characterized early Viking Age society gave way to ordered hierarchical kingdoms, yet the memory of the Viking Age persisted in Scandinavian culture. The Icelandic sagas, written in the 13th and 14th centuries, preserved oral traditions about the great raids, explorations and settlements. These literary masterpieces, combining history, myth, and fiction, kept alive the memory of a time when Scandinavians had ranged across the known world, feared and respected by all who encountered them. The sagas presented an idealized version of Viking Age society, emphasizing heroic deeds, loyalty, honor, and the tragic consequences of broken oaths and family feuds. They served a social function, providing moral instruction and entertainment, while celebrating a heroic past that contrasted with the more constrained and Christianized present. Modern scholars struggle to determine how much historical truth the sagas contain, as they were written centuries after the events they describe and shaped by the literary conventions and values of medieval Iceland. Egil's saga tells of Egil Skallagrimsson, warrior, poet, and farmer, whose life spanned the transition from pagan to Christian Iceland. His poetry, some of the finest in Old Norse literature preserved within the saga, demonstrated the sophisticated cultural achievements of Viking Age Scandinavia. These weren't simply brutal warriors, but people with complex literary traditions, legal systems, and artistic sensibilities. The Vinland sagas, describing Leif Erikson's voyages to North America, preserved knowledge of Norse exploration that academic historians dismissed as legend, until archaeological excavations at Lonso Meadows in the 1960s proved Vikings really had reached North America. The sagas combined accurate geographical details with fantastical elements, making them simultaneously valuable historical sources and frustrating puzzles for modern researchers. The impact of Viking expansion on languages across northern Europe persists today. English absorbed hundreds of Old Norse words during the Danelaw period. Common words like sky, window, knife, husband, sister, egg, cake, skin, leg, and they all derive from Old Norse. The penetration of everyday vocabulary shows how thoroughly Norse settlers integrated with Anglo-Saxon populations in regions they controlled. Even basic grammatical structures in English show Norse influence. The pronoun system, particularly the use of they, them, their, instead of older English forms, came from Old Norse. The simplification of English grammar compared to other Germanic languages may reflect the need for communication between Old English and Old Norse speakers, who needed to understand each other despite speaking related but distinct languages. Place names throughout northern England, Scotland, Ireland, and Normandy preserve Old Norse words. The suffix by, meaning town, appears in hundreds of English place names like Derby, Rugby, and Grimsby. The suffix thwaite, meaning clearing, appears in names like Braithwaite and Lankthwaite. The suffix thorpe, meaning hamlet, appears in Scunthorpe and Mablethorpe. Each name marks a location where Norse settlers established communities. Scottish islands bear Norse names like Orkney and Shetland, reflecting centuries of Norse control. Iceland and Greenland carry names given by their Norse discoverers. The Faroe Islands, meaning sheep islands in Old Norse, preserve their Viking Age name. The linguistic legacy maps Norse expansion as clearly as any historical document. The legal influence was equally significant. The English word law itself comes from Old Norse lagu. The concept of a jury, citizens judging their peers, has roots in Scandinavian legal traditions where free men assembled to decide disputes. The Thing, the Norse assembly where legal and political matters were decided, influenced the development of representative institutions throughout regions Vikings settled. Iceland's Althing, established around 930, claims to be the oldest surviving parliament in the world. While that claim is debatable depending on definitions, the Althing represented sophisticated democratic traditions within Viking Age society. Free men gathered annually to pass laws, settle disputes, and make collective decisions. The law speaker recited 1/3 of the law code from memory each year, preserving legal traditions orally before literacy became widespread. These legal assemblies weren't primitive gatherings. They featured complex procedural rules, formal advocacy, and sophisticated legal reasoning. The fact that illiterate societies could maintain consistent legal systems through purely oral transmission demonstrates cognitive capabilities that modern people, dependent on written records, struggle to appreciate. Viking Age Scandinavians memorized vast amounts of legal, historical, and poetic material with accuracy that seems almost superhuman today. The artistic legacy of the Viking Age influenced medieval European art. The distinctive Norse artistic styles, featuring intertwined animal motifs and complex geometric patterns, spread throughout regions Vikings controlled. The Jellinga style, Mammon style, Ringerike style, and Ernest style represent evolving aesthetic traditions that influenced manuscript illumination, stone carving, and metalwork across northern Europe. The Ernst Stave Church in Norway, built around 1130 near the end of the Viking Age, features elaborate wood carvings in the late Viking style, demonstrating the continuity between pagan Norse artistic traditions and Christian Scandinavian culture. The sinuous intertwined animals carved into the doorway represent artistic sophistication equal to anything produced elsewhere in medieval Europe. The transition from Viking Age to medieval Scandinavian kingdoms was gradual rather than abrupt. There was no single moment when Vikings ceased to exist. Rather, over several generations, the conditions, technologies, and social structures that had created the Viking phenomenon evolved into something different. By the 13th century, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were recognisably European kingdoms, Christian, monarchical, and integrated into continental political and economic systems. Yet the memory of the Viking Age, of the time when Scandinavians burst onto the European stage with revolutionary maritime technology and terrifying ferocity, never disappeared. It inspired medieval Icelanders to write their sagas. It influenced Scandinavian national identities as those emerged in the modern period. And it continues to fascinate people today, spawning countless books, films, television series, and video games that draw inspiration from that era. The raid on Lindisfarne on June 8, 793 was just the beginning. The Scandinavian expansion it inaugurated would last 3 centuries, reshape medieval Europe, and leave legacies in language, genetics, law, art, and culture that persist to the present day. Those monks killed on a foggy June morning could never have imagined the consequences of that single attack, how it marked the opening of an era that would see Scandinavian warriors and settlers ranging from Baghdad to Newfoundland, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. The dragon ships appeared through the morning mist at Lindisfarne, and when they finally departed from history's stage centuries later, they left behind a medieval world fundamentally transformed by their presence. The shield wall had not merely crashed into Europe, it had carved its mark so deeply that 1,000 years later we still feel its impact.